Hi everyone. My name is Peter Malachy. I am the chapter chair of the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. Joined with me with Robb Kidd, staff person for the Sierra Club, and as well as a number of our transportation leaders here in the state of Vermont. There's been so much happening related to transportation in the past year and a half, and there's definitely more to come with this deep dive, or shall we say, sneak peek into the T-bill that is coming up, transportation bill. With that, we're gonna start off with a short video from Mollie.
This is Representative Mollie Burke of Brattleboro, and I'm sitting here in the House Transportation Room and talking about H101, which is a very ambitious bill that I put forward to get incorporated into the transportation bill, which talks about ways to reduce our climate emissions, make transportation more affordable for Vermonters, and just create a better quality of life in our communities. We are talking about things like complete streets, which means that all streets need to be designed for all users, not just vehicles, which is how this American experiment has proceeded. And we're getting a lot of really inspiration from a lot of sources like Transportation for Vermonters and AARP and some of the things about the Better Connections and Better Communities grants and the Downtown Transportation Fund. So there's a lot of things happening in transportation that are very exciting. We need to figure out how to fund them. It's always a challenge. But I do think there's a change of attitude about what transportation means and the importance of cutting our emissions.
So as we've heard, it's more critical now than ever for us to be responsible for our emissions. And to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to be introducing Representative John Bartholomew. He's an active member of Sierra Club and on the House Transportation Committee. So he'll be giving us a little bit of a deep dive for his insights into what this bill will mean for us in the next year and probably farther. So go ahead and take it away, John.
Oh, thank you. And thanks to Mollie. I wish she could be here with me. She's one of my colleagues on the Transportation Committee. Robb suggested I start with saying a little bit about myself and why I'm passionate about these issues. I am in the House of Representatives for Vermont. This is my seventh term, and I spent 5 of those terms, 10 years on the Agriculture and Forestry Committee, and the last biennium in this one, I'm on transportation. I'm also a former executive committee member of the Vermont Chapter of the Sierra Club. I'm a retired veterinarian and a retired public health service officer, and I live in a co-housing community and a working farm. And I've always been passionate about wildlife, the natural world, environmental issues, and sustainability. And I've really become alarmed over the years at the path our civilization is taking. We've really seemed to fail to learn the lessons of history. And if you look back at past civilizations, many of those that have failed because of resource use issues. And now we're facing a civilization that's really worldwide. So it's kind of scary. And I remember back when I was in junior high school, and I won't say when that was, but even back then we were talking about the greenhouse effect and its possible effect on climate. And I'm just always think back to when Jimmy Carter was president. If we had listened to him and taken his lead, things would be pretty easy to fix at this point. But that's no longer the case. It's no longer going to be easy to fix the problems facing us. The Transportation Committee is an interesting committee to be on. I enjoy it. One of the most important aspects from climate change is the transportation sector in Vermont generates 40% of our CO2 emissions. So it really is a logical place to start when you're trying to look at controlling our climate, our carbon emissions. The testimony in our committee is often dominated by the Agency of Transportation. And I don't mean to sound really critical about that because it's a very large agency that is extremely important to the state, covering, of course, our roads and our bridges, but our railroads and airports, motor vehicle, the Department of Motor Vehicles, it's safety, all kinds of stuff. So it really is very large, very complex with a very big budget. And the Transportation Committee is one of the money committees in the House. So we spend a lot of time going over the agency's proposed budget that's proposed by the governor.
She's back.
So often our committee goes through the entire,
in
the
Through the basement
entire,
door.
I think some other. Often our committee goes through the whole legislative session, which is surprisingly short and only passes out 2 bills. We, in the first part of the biennium, the House will work on the transportation bill while the Senate is working on the DMV bill. And then in the second half, we switch. We pass the T bill over to the Senate and they pass the DMV bill over to us. So often, although we have many bills on our wall, meaning bills that have been introduced by other members of the House, we often don't get to those, but we will incorporate some of those into the transportation bill or the DMV bill. There have been a subset of us who are really passionate about climate issues, and we have the past 3 legislative sessions, we've introduced bills such as the one Mollie mentioned. This year we passed, or we've introduced what we're calling the Transportation Affordability Act. Back in 2021, we had what we called the Transportation Modernization Act, and in 22, we had the Transportation Innovation Act. And all of these were dealing with, in one way or the other, with some climate issues. And none of them went through as bills, separate bills that were introduced, but we go through and we as a committee pick out aspects of these bills to insert into the T bill. And that's what we've actually started today. We've gotten through a lot of the budget stuff with the agency. And so we've been really looking at the parts of this Transportation Affordability Act that we might be able to incorporate. I think we can really look at some of our progress, particularly in electrification. We're hearing good news about the future of availability of electric cars in Vermont. And we've got various incentives to try to encourage Vermonters to get into more fuel efficient vehicles or into electric vehicles, or give up vehicles altogether and switch to e-bikes. We're recognizing that incentives isn't enough. We're spending a lot of money and effort to create an infrastructure because people are not going to buy electric vehicles if they don't have a good way to charge them. We're also focusing a lot on a committee about livability. We're making, I think, significant progress in convincing the agency that it isn't just about cars and getting cars moving as fast and efficiently as possible, but it's also about creating livable downtowns and communities, walkable, bikeable, and mass transit systems. So, and rail. So we're making a lot of progress, and the agency has been a good partner with us in that. And I think we're even making progress so that even on all, we've got progressives on the committee as well as Republicans and Democrats. And while we don't always agree on the direction to go, I think at least at this point, everyone is accepting that this is a real challenge that we have to face. And hopefully we're going to be able to make some continued progress with this year's T bill. And I think I'll stop there and let others have the floor for a while. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, John. If you'd like to follow him and his work, you can find him around the State House. Next up is Katie Gallagher from VNRC. She is the Transportation Coordinator and Sustainable Communities Program Coordinator and Director. She has a couple of things to say about the transportation bill as well. Take it away.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to share my screen. As Peter said, I direct the Sustainable Communities Program for the Vermont Natural Resources Council, which is another statewide environmental organization. But as part of that work, I coordinate Transportation for Vermonters, which is a coalition, which is what I'm going to talk more about today, our policy priorities. We have about 15 advocacy members that are listed here. I won't go through all of them. We have another dozen or so kind of non-advocacy affiliates who help to inform us on policy and other things. We actually just had our first Citizen Lobby Day today. So the picture on the left here is from a vehicle emissions test that we did to see how quickly my husband's car filled up this plastic bag with exhaust, and it was 57 seconds, if anybody would have guessed that. But it was a really great day, and really appreciative of the work of Robb and the Sierra Club for helping to coordinate all of that and bring folks together to talk about transportation, because as you all know, transportation is a really huge and broad topic. And so from the Transportation for Vermonters perspective, climate and the environment is a really huge part of it, but we're also looking at it from the affordability perspective, understanding that transportation is the second highest cost for households in Vermont after housing, which is incredibly unaffordable. It's also a accessibility issue for folks who don't have access or reliable access to vehicles. That means that you might have trouble getting to your job, which we're hearing a lot from employers these days about how it's not just housing that's a barrier for getting employees, but also transportation. Barrier to getting to healthcare, to getting your kids to school, and so on and so forth. It's also a big issue when we are thinking about our air and water pollution. So again, from all of these different reasons, the good news is when we think about how to achieve an accessible and sustainable transportation system, we're generally all going in the same direction. So that's the good news, but there is still a lot to be done, which is what we are trying to work on. So I'm going to just touch on a couple of our priorities that we feel like might have some more legs this session, in part thanks to Representative Burke's bill and the work of the House Transportation Committee to explore these other policy options beyond what the Agency of Transportation has proposed. The first, looking at electrification, as was noted last year, we made a lot of progress on the EV and EV charging side of things. So this year, especially for our coalition, we're looking towards boosting the incentive program for e-bikes, which is not only a really great mobility tool to reduce emissions, but also for folks who might not be able to use a bike as a mobility tool without that extra assist. The money that was set aside last year for the incentive program got spent within less than 2 months. So that was super quickly. Because of that, we were able to get in the House passed version of the Budget Adjustment Act, which is essentially how they amend last year's budget. We got an extra $100,000 in there for e-bikes, and we're looking for $500,000 for the incentive program for the upcoming year, and hoping for that to be more income sensitive and targeted towards lower income folks. This is another pic on the left of Representative Jay Hooper, who tried out one of Local Motion's e-bikes in the cafeteria today, which was pretty fun. Yep. The next priority for us that's really important is street design. So this is, when you think about how we experience our streets and roads, both from the perspective of a pedestrian or a biker, but also a driver. If you are walking out into the street, or you're biking, or you're rolling, you need to feel safe in order to use that street or road. For a driver, it's also important that you are able to visualize and see the pedestrian who's trying to cross the street, or that, we have different visual cues like trees lining the street so that you are going to go slower on that road. So these are all these types of things that go into designing streets for certain reasons. The Vermont state standards that I have in the first bullet here, this is the kind of technical design guidelines for engineering and constructing roads in Vermont. This was created in the mid-90s. It has not been updated since then. We initiated during the last session an update to that through the Agency of Transportation. So they are working on it. This year, we want to make sure that they are asking the legislature for enough money, which we think is close to $1 million, to do that update. And this, again, is really important because this is how we get to designing these streets for kind of policy outcomes and goals that we're looking for, like smart growth and complete streets. Complete streets is the general concept and policy goal that we are designing streets and considering the needs of all users when we are designing and building streets. So again, for example, the street isn't just for a vehicle, but if you are biking, you are walking, we are doing our best to meet your needs. And that's going to look different depending on where you are and what the capacity and needs of your town are. But it's a really important piece. Our complete streets policy that was passed, Representative Burke led on this as well about a decade ago. It's a great policy. It does not have a lot of teeth. And so this year we're looking for kind of a light version of an update that's really focused on transparency and data and training for municipalities. But our goal is to really set the stage for a larger statute update in the following year so that we can kind of set the groundwork with the Agency of Transportation and with the legislature for a more comprehensive change. In terms of grants and funding, I wanted to highlight the MTI grant program, which is the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grant Program. It's relatively new, but it has been a huge success in being able to fund relatively small projects, but also larger innovative initiatives like micro-mobility that require a larger kind of upfront seed funding to get off the ground. This is really important in a state like Vermont that is rural and does have legitimate issues funding transportation and having solutions that work for a smaller population. So we need to be able to fund the kind of creative thinking and entrepreneurship to have new solutions and exploring, maybe, and they're not all going to work. I also threw up here, and some of these were mentioned already, some other grant programs that exist, especially if you're looking to implement transportation programs, infrastructure initiatives in your town or community. There's some really great programs that exist, and I would recommend looking into these, and happy to talk more about them at a later point. Also wanted to highlight sustainable land use. We can't talk about transportation without talking about land use. And this is a little bit outside of the general transportation conversation, but that's partly why I want to bring it up, which is housing is also part of this conversation. So we can't talk about the housing crisis without pairing it with our transportation needs. So there's housing legislation currently in the works that is looking to re-legalize reasonable housing density within our downtowns and village centers. So these areas that we've already invested in infrastructure, and also looking at things like parking and where our zoning is mandating at times excessive and unnecessary parking, which means that we are losing that valuable land for parking that's not being able to be used for housing or commercial space, and is also subsidizing, again, vehicles when we should be using that space to have more walkable and vibrant community centers. Two pieces on the VTrans front that we're tracking and our stakeholders in is a smart growth study that is currently underway and should have some results coming out this spring that will help to look at the impact of smart growth development on how many vehicle miles traveled there are and that relationship. And then there's also a federally mandated federal program that's the carbon reduction program and related carbon reduction strategy, which will look at all the different ways in which we can reduce our emissions, but land use is kind of a side part of that conversation. And then my last slide here, and I'm just going to lightly touch on this because Joey will talk about it a bit more, but just want to highlight that the big question mark around funding is one that Transportation for Vermonters is really eager to lift up and acknowledge through the legislature and beyond that we have a real critical gap and a real need to address what will be and already is a shortage of revenue and of funding for transportation. This is going to be a problem for sure into the future. And so we need to be thinking boldly and creatively as to how we're able to have long-term sustained revenues that can fund the transportation solutions that we are looking for. So I will leave it there. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to hop off in a couple minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions offline. And thanks to Rob for having me on today.
All right, thank you, Katie. Here are her socials, so you can follow her at Transportation for Vermont. Keep up to date on all the good stuff that's coming out of there related to the T-bill. Our final guest speaker tonight is going to be Johana Miller from VNRC, who is a great climate advocate, friend to a lot of folks, and really good person in general. So passing off to you.
Thank you, Peter. That's very kind. And I just want to make sure before my fantastic colleague Katie has to appeal, I want to just make sure if anyone had any questions related to anything that Katie presented. She's the expert in that arena, and I would not do as well, although Rob could probably pinch hit. But if people have questions for Katie before she has to go, I just want to provide that space. Is that okay, Peter, Rob, everyone?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
This is,
So anybody wants to raise their hand quickly, or?
yeah, I can call on anybody who raises their hand. All right, well, Matthew.
My question is about, what's the budget look like for transportation as a whole? Because I know Vermont can't do the stuff it needs to do because it's tied around budget and finance throughout the state of Vermont. We all know that together. Is there a way to ask for more money by USDA? I know that's so hard. That's like a federal government. They give strict deadlines. Is there a way to speed up the process to get these enacted quickly for accessibility reasons? Because we've been discussing this over and over and over again to make sure that we have these infrastructure in place. And it just we don't want to go to court to have that. And I'm a person with disability, so if the ADA, we need to take that seriously and try to figure out to complete what our objectives are. So yes, that's something I'm bringing up right now. So it needs to be said. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, that's a great question. Joey's going to talk a bit more about how we can explore and some of the work that's going to look at a regional approach to some of that funding. But in terms of what we're currently looking at for a budget, I will say that I think that there is room to broaden our perspective a bit more, which for me, that looks like because a lot of the transportation budget for the Agency of Transportation, as you noted, is tied to federal dollars. So a lot of it is the federal government says, we'll give you X amount of matching dollars for X, Y, and Z. And that's a big part of how the agency's budget is crafted. So they do kind of have their hands tied in certain ways. There has been, I think, a lot of good work and progress that has been made, especially with the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, which has made new rules and certain requirements related to accessibility greenhouse gas reductions, reconnecting communities, which is a little bit less of an issue in Vermont, but seeing things in that vein. At the same time, as I was saying, like transportation is related, as you noted, to all of these different pieces. So maybe we need to be looking more beyond what we can reasonably fund through the transportation budget specifically. And we've started to do this a bit with the climate and transportation related initiatives, where we can start to look at funding from other kind of pots of money. But that's kind of where my head goes, in addition to the ways that the state can try to raise money, which Joey will talk about more. In terms of federal monies, I think that you're right, that we can be kind of looking in different directions, because it is related to all of these different pieces, and not just roads and bridges. Hope that was helpful.
Great. Thank you. And we have a question from Chuck Fenton. Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, Chuck Fenton in Heartland. And my question that I haven't heard anything mentioned about is efforts to get our regional transit franchisees to work more closely together to provide transit alternatives that cross the boundaries between the franchisees. I live in Heartland, which is on the border of two franchisees, Tri-State and Connecticut River, and it seems very challenging to get transit services that cross the borderline to service us. So that's my question. Thank you.
That's a good question, and I don't think I have a good answer for that. I'll say, which is a little bit of an aside, but there's my understanding is that the transit agencies are, and I see David's recommending a transit authority, and that's something that we've talked a bit about. We do, so our transit agencies are siloed. They have an association where they come and meet and talk about issues and things like that. I'm not very involved in that work, so I can't really speak to their ability to coordinate. I know that they have on certain particular issues, but in terms of a broader planning and vision system, I don't think that's happening. So I have a planning background, so that's my kind of bias, is we need something at the state level. Maybe it does look like a transit authority that is not just with transportation, but and they're starting to do it with climate, but how do we coordinate all of these different pieces? And I think that the transit agencies and making those multimodal connections is really critical. Rob, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I added in the chat, is we had that included in the Transportation Innovation Act, and the heads of the Agency of Transportation quickly came in and squashed it, saying they don't need to do that because they're doing a lot of coordination. But that's one of the points I'm going to go into, is the Agency of Transportation has a lot of really good folks who are on their team, but a lot of the top decisions are being handed down to them, so they're restricted from saying things that they think may be really good. So as David just put in, that VTrans is a roadblock to some of the policies, but there's some of the agency staff who are trying to do the right thing, but we can't get things through. And this is where the importance of following the Transportation Committee is really critical, because the Transportation Committee is the one who's supposed to direct the agency what to do. It's not the reverse, the agency directing the House Transportation Committee, the legislature. The legislature makes the rules, and the administration carries out the rules that the legislature dictates. And that's where all you are important to address.
All right. Do we have any more questions before we move on to our next speaker? All right. Johana Miller, take it away.
Thanks, Peter. I'm just going to share screen, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit more after talking about the Transportation Affordability Act and the work, the important work that's happening this session. And I'm going to be brief because I want to hear from others and answer any questions to the degree that I can and hear comments. But I want to just zoom back to underscore for folks that, as you probably are well aware, transportation is 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we collectively emit in this state, a very rural state. So it was a core focus of the Climate Council. And I just wanted to highlight here a few high-level things that the Climate Council recognized as really important strategies to begin to build out a cleaner, less polluting, and more multimodal transportation system. There's a big focus in the Climate Action Plan, again, in a rural state, as we work to create longer-term strategies for giving people options to get out of their car, that, making sure that people in the meantime have access to cleaner, more efficient vehicles. In the Climate Action Plan, big focus early on, especially in the electrification of vehicles and a building out of a vehicle charging system to support Vermonters in our rural reaches and in accessing those kinds of vehicles. And one important driver in that is, is recently the state of Vermont adopted California's advanced clean cars and advanced clean truck rules. This is the one big component of the Climate Action Plan that is actually moving forward, that's going to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It requires vehicle manufacturers to sell an increasing number of zero emission vehicles, ramping up starting in model year 2026. And by 2035, requiring them to sell only new electric vehicles into the state of Vermont. So it's an obligation on the manufacturers, and that's really focused on the electrification component of the work. The Climate Action Plan also recognized what Katie just spoke to so importantly about the need to build a multimodal sort of pathway to get Vermonters where they need to go, which is making investments, strategic investments in infrastructure and programs that support walking, biking, public transit, microtransit, a variety of different options enabled by things like complete streets, et cetera. The Climate Council didn't have the sort of, I think, the important mathematical analysis and information that the vehicle miles traveled greenhouse gas emission reduction strategy is going to deliver, as Katie referenced. I think that's really important to begin to help us think about how do we quantify and measure and then make investments in transportation demand management strategies like walking, biking, public transit, et cetera. And then another important piece, the biggest recommendation of the Climate Action Plan to make certain pollution reduction emissions in the transportation sector and then raise the revenues that we need to invest in a multimodal cleaner system was to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative Program. And that was a regional program that cratered a little bit, or was put on ice, whatever you want to say, right before we adopted the Climate Action Plan in December of 2021. So from there, we got to work spending the last year looking at, what else do we need to do to fill the gap and make sure that we can support Vermonters in transitioning to cleaner transportation and mobility options. And we know we need that work to be informed by ongoing outreach and engagement with the public and begin, really maximize the opportunity. I'm sure you all are well aware of incredible federal investments that have come into the state of Vermont through programs like the American Rescue Plan Act in the transportation space, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act program, and then of course there's the Inflation Reduction Act. But the Infrastructure and Jobs Act program is particularly, I think, impactful and powerful for the transportation space, which Katie referenced. That obligates the Agency of Transportation to craft a carbon reduction strategy, which they are in the process of, and that requires them to look at their capital programs and begin to quantify the sort of greenhouse gas emission impact of existing programs and how they can potentially maximize existing programs and or round them out with strategies like that are identified in the Transportation Affordability Act. But the big thing I wanted to leave you with is we went back to the drawing board after a year of looking at how are we going to fill the gap on our primary pollution reduction strategy that we had identified in the climate action plan, which is again was a regional cap and invest program. And where we landed is we don't know exactly what policy or regulatory tool that we need. But what we do know is that the only currently known policy options for which evidenced by other states, provinces, countries, and jurisdictions to deliver on pollution reductions at the scale and pace required by the climate science set by the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change is to fundamentally do one or more things, cap and invest, or cap and reduce policy, and or performance standard to begin to obligate the transportation sector, which is again 40% of our emissions, to begin to ratchet down on the carbon intensity of the product that drives the significant share of vehicles, internal combustion vehicles in the state of Vermont. So, and as Katie acknowledged, both of these strategies will help to raise long-term revenue for building out a cleaner, more multimodal system that will serve Vermonters now and into the future. And that's really important because the Infrastructure and Jobs Act in particular, which is going to help really invest in the infrastructure and the programs that we need, those dollars won't last forever, and there will be a cliff coming probably sometime in the end of 2026 or 2027 when we're going to need to have identified a funding source to build out the system that we need. So that's a very high level overview of what's been happening in the Climate Council space, trying to set the stage for an overarching policy and regulatory approach to actually drive the kind of transportation transformation that the Transportation Affordability Act is doing this legislative session, I hope, and what we aim to do over the course of time to set Vermont up for a cleaner, more multimodal system. I'm turning it back to you, Peter, and I look forward to hearing more and answering any questions if I can.
Yeah. Would you like to open up the floor for a couple questions, or?
I am happy to do whatever works. I wasn't sure. I don't know if Rob, you were going to frame out anything else, but I'm happy to try and answer.
Yeah, well, I just take a couple quick questions about what you just presented on, so it's fresh in people's heads, but just do two, and then I have a couple follow-up things.
Oh, we have two currently in the chat. One from Deborah. Are there ways to reduce barriers for Vermonters who currently live off-grid to move towards electric cars?
I would have to say, Deborah, I would have to think about that a little bit more. I haven't given a huge amount of thought, although I would say if people are living off grid, my guess is that they are powered by solar and probably could, bring on some sort of charging system to power an electric car, powered by the sun in their backyard. I don't know. I live in downtown Montpelier where, I don't. But I think there are options probably to do that. And I don't know if through the Infrastructure and Jobs Act or other programs, if there would be a program specifically tailored to those Vermonters who live off grid, but I think it's a fair question and I had not considered it and I should.
I was just approached by a solar developer who told me that they were working on trying to fully power electric vehicles by renewable energy, exclusively through solar. I know SunCommon has their little sun port that you can plug in, but that's basically they're connected onto the grid. I think a lot of their power, but I think that is something we need to look further into.
All right, and we have another question from Michael. Has VTrans looked at including mode shifts for urban areas?
There
And
are
I'm
people on this call who are better able to answer that question than I am. I don't know about that. Representative Bartholomew, or I did see
What-
McDonald on this
I'm not
call.
even sure what a mode shift is.
Moving from car to transit, microtransit, bike, walking. I think that they are trying to do that. I don't want to put too much eggs in this basket, but this sort of vehicle miles traveled reduction and strategy and analysis, I think, is intended to inform how they expand different programs to serve, I think, goals like you're articulating here.
all right. And one last question from Matthew.
My question is about, the federal government, but this is something serious. Most states have already contacted the USDA federal government. Should Vermont become more involved in actually outreach to the federal government, USDA, and tell them, hey, we are in person. We need to get these funds to the state, not just a federal delegation. Should the governor approach the USDA too as well? So we have that coincide collective mind and tell them, hey, we're serious. We need to actually have these money within our state too as well, not just assume that the three federal leaders do it by themselves, because we're all in this together. It ain't just, one party that does it all. I mean, is there a way to coincide with the federal government or keep in contact with the USDA to make sure that, that all states, including rural states within Vermont, are actually at the table with the discussion and conversation that we're having, so we have those funds like in hand, or hey, here's funds for your state, so we can get that brief of what's coming into the state instead of just have to rely on the three to do the work when actually everybody collectively can come together to work on those same issues. Thank you.
I guess for my part, I would say it's a really important point. Thank you for raising it, Matthew. And I would highly encourage you and others to outreach to the governor and encourage him to, from his very important position, collaborate with our congressional delegation and I think work to maximize all the different opportunities that are coming down through these federal programs. I think it's a really important point. I'm not sure exactly what is happening in that arena, but I appreciate the core tenet. And then I'm just going to answer Aaron's question. I welcome other folks' ideas and strategies and suggestions for what public engagement and outreach looks like. I just want to flag for people that the Climate Council and the new Vermont Climate Action Office is looking to hire an outreach and public engagement point person, which I think is intended to help really provide some synergy between the Vermont Climate Council, the adopted climate action plan, and the recommendations to the Vermont public, so that we are, as we begin to lift up and implement those programs, we are hearing from and iterating programs and policy recommendations based on public priorities.
I would add that in terms of national funding, that we do have a very strong congressional delegation. Obviously, there's some concerns with Senator Leahy's retirement, because he was there so long and created just an incredible benefit for Vermont. Just based on our size, the benefits we got were huge. But the three we have in Congress now are very strong and looking after our interests, I'm sure, in the best way they can, and probably better than anyone else in our state could do. I'd also like to add, in terms of, I think all of you on the call probably know this, but in Vermont, we are pretty fortunate in that your legislators at the state level are very accessible to you. And when the phone rings from a constituent, it doesn't ring in my staff's office, it rings at my house. And I answer the phone, and so we're really accessible. So if you have any issue, not just transportation, but any issue that you're following, reach out to your state representative, or in some cases you'll have two state representatives and your senators, and they'll read it. They may not always have time to respond, but they're going to read it themselves. So people are very accessible, and I think this is a real asset for our state, that we're relatively small and able to provide that kind of constituent service. Oh, and I'd also add, if you do write, make sure that you say the town you're from, because so often a legislator will get something, and if it's not related to their committee, and you've got no idea who the person is, they could be from New Mexico, and sometimes that happens. We have no clue where this person is. So make sure when you write to, whether it's the congressional delegation or your state representatives or senators, make sure you say where you're from.
Great. Thank you, Representative John Bartholomew. I'm going to pass it off to Rob to connect the dots and kind of synergize everything. And then we might be able to get to these last couple questions before we leave. All right, take it away, Rob.
Yeah, so that actually segue is perfect. Representative John Bartholomew mentioned what I was actually just going to lead off with, and it also connected around what Aaron's question was about public engagement. We talked about earlier on is the Transportation Committee goes into this whole testimony period where they bring in witness after witness who primarily is the Agency of Transportation folks, because they deal with an $860 million budget, so they need to get the things right. But they don't have much opportunity for public input, as say a lot of the other committees. Like a lot of other committees will take 3 weeks of testimony in one particular bill, and you'll have a parade of witnesses from all angles to shape that bill. In the House Transportation Committee, as I said, as they only produce that bill, you're not getting the public input as we are in everywhere else. So it's very critical that everybody who joins this participates and contacts their state representatives. And because it's a transportation related issue, I just want to show on here is on the website, it has the listing of who's on the Transportation Committee. You see that the chair is actually a brand new chair, Sarah Kofi, and then Representative Bush Shaw from Pittsford, Timmy Corcoran from Bennington, John right there, Mollie Burke, and we have Scott Campbell from St. Johnsbury, Lenora Dodge from Essex, Kate Lally from Shelburne, Patty McCoy from Rutland, Phil Pouch from Heinsberg, and Matt Walker from, I think, Fairfax. These people are very critical and they need to hear from you. And so whichever angle that you're interested in presenting, come up to that committee page and you can directly email them. So I just see here, like the chair, it has her email right there onto it. It has her phone number, and you can call them and say, hey, I'm very much interested. Now, I highly recommend that you only really call your own representative so you could find them and share that information to that. But since we just got through this point of the conversation, is 4 or 5 years ago, I know with Joey Miller, a couple of us went into the House Transportation Committee to talk about EV incentives. And we were trying to get the Volkswagen fraud settlement money to be pushed towards EV incentives. We received so much pushback from that committee, and we're even friends of ours who were allies were like, kind of, you guys can't get that. That's a crazy. You're going to get $3 million in incentives. And last year, we were able to get $20 million for incentive programs, $20 million, nearly $20 million for infrastructure. And the reason why is because we kept pushing and asking for that particular information. So you need to push this, and sometimes it takes a couple of years for those policies to move forward. So within the Sierra Club, we've been focusing a lot more in the last couple of years, looking at transit solutions, looking at bike ped. And it's a struggle because when we have the agency of transportation comes into their committee and tells everybody that they're doing everything. Like I looked at John one day and I said, we don't need to do anything here. They've done everything. They solved everything. But as we can tell, we have a lot of problems we need to address here in Vermont, and we need to do more of it. So we have a short action item that the Sierra Club has a petition page. You don't need to use this, but I request everybody on here to sign it, and a message will be sent directly to your state rep. And basically what it is I'm going to show you on here. Basically it's just a petition, basically just saying that we need to address this. We need to commit to long-term funding for sustainable transportation aligned with budgets and priorities. We need to expand transportation to reduce dependence on single occupancy vehicles and get us out of internal combustion vehicles and better serve all Vermonters. And we also need to continue reducing our barriers to electric vehicle adoptions. And that means all of them, to make sure low-income Vermonters can access them. So even the challenge, whoever asked that question about EV off-grid, for those who are living off-grid, I haven't even contemplated that one before, but we need to find ways that everybody can join into this, not just staying in the conversation within the agency of transportation. You all, as active citizens, need to start reaching out to your representatives, your senators, to change that conversation, because the next 3 weeks, next week, and then the following week is known as the town meeting day break. Representatives and senators will be home during that break. They're not in the legislature. Then 2 weeks after that is what's known as the legislative crossover time frame, where the House Transportation Committee will pass their bill out, and then it will be sent to the Senate to vote on, and we'll go through the same Senate transportation process. Now, I am glad one thing is we have a greater support within the House Transportation Committee. The Senate Transportation Committee is a little bit more challenging because there's only 5 members, but Senator Dick Mazza and Colchester is not the most friendliest to our work. He's actually been very opposed to a lot of bike ped programs. He hasn't been really supportive of transit issues, but we have to move that forward. So we have a lot of work to do, but by all of you reaching out to your legislators, getting in touch with them, commenting about that we need greater bike ped access. We need long-term sustainable funding and transportation. We need to continue removing barriers to EV adoptions. We can get there, and that's the only way to go forward with that. So I guess we can do a couple of questions before we proceed in ending this, but that was basically the short end of my comments for today.
All right, thank you, Rob. And be sure to sign and date that petition if you can before you leave here tonight. We have one question that we haven't answered from Michael Arnold. Would it be great to do outreach to new American communities? How are we responding to the folks who have just got here? And this can be for the whole panel.
I'll start off with it, Joey or John, if you have any questions on that additionals. That's one of the things is we do have to go out there and reach all different communities and get them their input. And it's a harder issue, just for with the Sierra Club. We're outside of me, I'm the only staff member. So the rest of us are volunteers. So if you're able to join us and volunteer with us and help us do more outreach, we could direct the Agency of Transportation to do more outreach. There was some language in the last year transportation bill about making sure that their materials are in multiple languages, because that was a major barrier for connecting with those communities, because they couldn't read the materials that were being produced. So they didn't know about policies. I know the Center for Whole Communities has been doing some more outreach, but it's going to be the challenges of what organization has the capacity to do it and and it's something that we should all keep in mind about how to reach out to those. Joey or John, do you have any additions to that?
Only to say that I think it's really important that we're talking about this, and it's a critical question. And we are lucky to have passed the state environmental justice policy last year, and that will be an overarching policy that's going to support our efforts in the environmental climate field more broadly. And I think what you have elevated is on the minds and radars of many, and I think there's a commitment to and a need for what you're describing, and I think it will ramp over time, supported by the environmental justice law.
One thing we're also focusing on, not so much for new Americans, but for all Vermonters, particularly those who are financially challenged, is to trying to find funding to continue zero fare. And there are no public transportation systems that pay for themselves. All of them require some level of federal or state support or local support to work. So just at what level can we continue this zero fare? It would be nice if we can continue it into the future. We're still trying to figure out if we can make that work in the budget.
So I just want to reference that Paul Zabriskie of Capstone is participating on this, and I know you've done some outreach for low-income Vermonters with your Mileage Smart program. Paul, are you able to join us?
I think so.
Good. I'd not like to put you on the spot, but I know you can talk about it in your sleep. So do you have anything to say about that?
So the question was about Mileage Smart?
Well, no, just reaching out to new communities, but it's related to Mileage Smart and your connections.
Okay.
Reaching out to people.
Well, new communities pose a number of challenges. The platforms we work from, some of them provide translations on our website, some don't, or limited languages. We've used some fascinating new tools to generate our content in Arabic and languages that nobody on the team is capable of understanding whether or not they accurately communicate information about our program. So there's a number of challenges, but the effort is being made, and I think we'll get better at this as time goes by. We are supported by the Agency of Transportation in moving to be much better about making our information available. We are launching a ride-hailing service over the course of 2023. That is, somebody asked a question earlier about mode shifting, and we're working on developing models that collaborate with existing transit, but reach out beyond the last mile or into the last mile, and into our rural communities that aren't currently served by transit, to provide an electric sedan service that helps with getting people to work, getting people to the doctor, getting people where they need to go, whether it be some of life's necessities or to their brother's funeral. Lots of reasons why people need to get there and are challenged in rural communities. So I'm rambling a bit, but that's what happens when you put me on the spot, Rob. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. Well, that's time for what we have tonight, but thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to learn a little bit more about.
Actually, Peter, I actually just wanted to acknowledge that David Pollerstorff had been asking some questions just about rail and highly subsidized car system. And I wanted him to be able to kind of just make a quick statement on that, because David's been passionate about supporting those programs and trying to transition us away from individualized cars. So David, are you there? Are you able to say something?
Sure. I'm traveling down to Florida in our electric car, which I don't believe is the future. But anyways, we're still hell bent on putting people into EVs. When you talk about new Americans in Burlington and Winooski, we have an 8-mile piece of track between these two towns, and it goes right through Winooski. We could be running rail there. All it would take is a couple $1 million of state help to buy that track and get it running with my Bud cars. You know, it's dead air coming out of VTrans as far as any ideas on this stuff, because they're car centric. And I'm really getting tired of their brick wall approach to how we attack these problems. And just so you know, half of my Bud cars are headed to Maine, where the state of Maine is subsidizing a 2-year run of a commuter with our cars from Brunswick, Maine up to Rockland. And they at least have the vision that this can work. We don't seem to have the vision that this can work.
Yeah, and thank you. And that's one of the areas that we've been kind of weaker on is the rail, because it's kind of like what we've said before is how the agency will tell us they're doing everything, and they kind of quickly put the kibosh on any of the policies, such as the transit authority for better coordination. And the policy committee, the House Transportation Committee, doesn't have the time to look into those things at the level that needs to. This is why it's very critical for the citizen advocates to touch base with their legislators and start demanding these conversations happen.
Yeah, and one more follow-up on the transit authority idea. We've been working this for many years, trying to figure out how to do it, but it is a problem with VTrans because they like control of what it is and what is there now. And when you have a transit authority, we can then integrate bus, rail, walking, biking, everything together. And it has to be statewide, because we have all these fiefdoms, GMT, and everybody's trying to raise money locally to make it work. That's why it doesn't work real well. And so it's I think really important to think this through and get something done.
Well, do you have any last minute things you'd like to add, Rob?
That's it. Thank you all very much for the conversation, and thank Joey for participating, and Representative John Bartholomew staying late at the State House. So we appreciate that. He's actually in the committee room. So thank you. And thank you all for joining us, and please make sure you touch base with your representatives and then your senators. And I'll share a video on this. And thank you, Paul, for adding, and David adding more to the comments.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Have a good rest of your night.